And welcome to the Texas Talks podcast. I am your host, Brad Swale. Today, I'm joined by conservative civil rights attorney and First Amendment litigator, Tony McDonald. Tony, how are you?
Great. Thanks for having me on.
It's a pleasure to speak with you. It's a very cold day here in Austin, Texas. I'm not sure where you are, but it's very cold, and so I'm glad to be doing a job like this where I'm inside.
Snow flurries here in Fort Worth, too.
Okay, cool. I gave a very brief description there. Civil rights attorney, conservative civil rights attorney, First Amendment litigator. What does that mean? Who are you? What do you do?
Yeah, so, I've been out talking about the Texas Ethics Commission, which is this thing that, most people have never heard of it, right? But it is, it's below most people's visibility line. But if you want to look into it, it's crazy bonkers. So we're going to blow some people's minds about what goes on in secret in this state. We basically have like secret speech Gestapo here in Texas. Most people don't know. And what do I do as an attorney? I represent conservative grassroots, right of center people in fighting against organizations like the Ethics Commission who are trying to infringe upon their First Amendment rights. I do other things around that, but that's a big part of my job.
So, just as a Texan myself and speaking to, I cover Texas politics, local politics. I talk about all that stuff. I look into it. Texas is often seen as a conservative bastion. I assume that the Texas Ethics Commission is a government agency empowered by the Texas legislature and the governor. And you're telling me that they are, there's some free speech issues there. And I think a lot of people would maybe find that jarring to think that there's free speech issues in Texas, given that it's, the conservative state that it is.
Sure. Yeah. People are surprised. So the Texas Ethics Commission was created back in 1991, and it's intentionally unaccountable. It's intentionally bipartisan. It was tasked by the voters whenever it was approved with only two things. It was supposed to set legislator salaries and recommend the legislative per diem, so what they get paid when they go down to Austin during the session. It's all it was assigned to do constitutionally. But immediately what the legislature did to these legislative appointees, this bipartisan panel of legislative appointees, is give them the power to enforce the state's regulations on campaign finance, lobbying, political disclosures, all of that kind of stuff. So all of these are areas that regulate private political speech, core First Amendment protected speech. It's like the only thing that's involved is speech. And it doesn't extend. People think, oh, well, maybe this is just something that's for elected officials or legislators. It actually applies across the board to any Texan. 30 million Texans are subject to the jurisdiction of this agency. And, you can spend as little as $100 in this state on a political sign. So if I went to the hardware store and bought, lumber and paint, and I put a sign in my yard that said, vote Abbott, right? And I spent $100 doing that, that would actually trigger a reporting requirement on my behalf. If I printed up some flyers in my own home and then I went and distributed those to my neighbor, that could require certain disclosures and disclaimers and filings with the Ethics Commission. And so what happens is if some person who doesn't like you, if you start to become effective and some person doesn't like you, they can file a complaint with the Texas Ethics Commission. The commission, if that complaint fits their form requirements, so even if the stuff in there is not true, if it's just the allegations fit the form requirements, they hold that they must open an investigation and you must cooperate in that investigation. You have no Fifth Amendment right to protect yourself. You must answer the charges against you. You must travel to Austin to meet behind closed doors before this panel. And essentially, you're at the mercy of this panel. If they find that you didn't fill out the paperwork correctly, they can fine you. I recently wrote an article about a lady from Houston, this little old lady from Houston. She disclosed $3,400 in political spending, but she didn't fill the forms out correctly. And a rival blogger who didn't like her filed a complaint with the Ethics Commission. She had all of her bank records subpoenaed. It's funny, she's a little old lady. She banked at Woodforest Bank, which if you're not familiar with what that is, that's the little bank that's at the front of Walmart. So when you're checking out at Walmart, she banks at Walmart. Right? This is not a sophisticated. This is not a big deal, right? This is a little old lady. They subpoenaed all of her bank records. They ordered her to come to hearings in Austin. She answered, she said, I don't have a car. I don't have a way to travel to Austin. They said, tough cookies, you have to come to our hearing. When she didn't show up, they gave her a default judgment, fined her $17,500 for not showing up, essentially, because she couldn't travel to Austin. That's the most egregious case that I've seen, but there's lots of these. In fact, I've got a case that's at the U.S. Supreme Court right now that started in 2012 about issues in 2010. So we're 15 years into litigation against these people about basic fundamental First Amendment rights. It's been $1 million litigation just trying to defend basic rights.
Yeah, I mean, I want to talk about. I believe you're talking about the Michael Quinn Sullivan versus the Texas Ethics Commission case. I definitely want to talk to you about that, and we will. I want
Sure.
to just rewind just a touch. When you're talking about the formation of the Texas Ethics Commission, it was intentionally bipartisan. I can wrap my head around that. It makes sense. Agree or disagree. I understand why that would
Yeah.
happen. They're not elected officials, correct?
Right.
They're
So,
appointed.
yeah, what actually happens is the appointees are recommended on lists from the political caucuses of the House and Senate. So the Senate Democrats and the Senate Republicans, the House Democrats and the House Republicans, they put forward lists of candidates. And then from that limited pool of candidates, the Speaker, Lieutenant Governor, and Governor pick people from those lists. And so it's
Okay.
4 and 4 Democrat and Republican. Technically it could be third party or something, but it's, in practical sense, because of the two-party system, it's Democrat
Right.
and Republican. And so, Democrats haven't won an election in this state in 30 years, and yet they are given half of this enforcement authority from these legislative appointees.
And you said that there was one other thing that so they were intentionally bipartisan, and I think you said intentionally unaccountable.
Yeah, I mean, well, so they very bold. They say we're bipartisan and we're independent,
Yeah.
right? Independent, it means unaccountable. There's no way to recall these people. There's no way to remove them. The only way to get somebody off of the Texas Ethics Commission is to appoint the replacement. And in fact, you've had commissioners in the past who've served as holdovers for, like nearly a decade, right?
Yeah.
Because they just never get around to putting anybody on there. And those who are familiar with Washington, D.C., the Federal Election Commission, there's a commissioner there who is currently a big conflict over whether Trump can remove her from the FEC.
Yeah.
Her term expired in 2007. Right. And so you see these things happening at the state level here. The problem really is what we see in Washington is partisan gridlock, which is actually better. Right here, you have the Republican and Democrat appointees on this commission kind of work together against, grassroots people.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, it certainly sounds the way that you describe it, like there should be some, I don't know, but like that there's some possibility for reform is what it sounds like.
Sure.
And I think maybe we can get to some of those ideas, as we talk about this Michael Quinn Sullivan case. Michael Quinn Sullivan, I think famously is the publisher for, the news organization is escaping me. What's it called?
Texas Scorecard.
There you go.
So,
Texas Scorecard. Yeah.
yeah. So today, Michael is the publisher of Texas Scorecard. Texas Scorecard began, in full disclosure, I was general counsel for Empower Texans, which launched Texas Scorecard back in the day. But Texas Scorecard began as a project of a group called Empower Texans, which also had the name Texans for Fiscal Responsibility.
Okay.
And one of their projects was publishing what's called the Fiscal Responsibility Index. People have seen these as ratings of how legislators voted. Here's how your legislator voted on fiscal issues. He gets an A, this guy gets a B.
Sure.
Well, one
We've
of the
seen those
things
types of report cards for a lot of different things. Yeah.
lots of organizations do it.
Sure.
One of the criticisms in the past, before Michael launched the Fiscal Responsibility Index, was, you guys just cherry pick votes. And so to rebut that, he said, look, I'm going to tell these legislators how we're going to score these votes before we actually put them on there. So, as the session rolls on, House Bill 100 is coming to the floor, and he would send an email out and he'd say, members of the legislature, we encourage you to vote yes. And we're going to put it on the index and tell your voters that however you vote, we're going to tell them how you voted. And so that was what he did. The 2 legislators who were committee chairmen, lieutenants of House Speaker Joe Strauss, who's a very liberal Republican speaker at the time, and who had scored very poorly on the index. These are guys who didn't, they were not getting good marks
Yeah.
on the index. They filed complaints with the Texas Ethics Commission back in 2012 during that extended primary, back when Ted Cruz, was running for Senate, and it was all this extended primary. Part of that primary activity was, oh, we're going to file these complaints before the Ethics Commission. That fight is still going and is literally this week. We've got amicus support coming in. The Attorney General has come in to support our petition for cert. But we actually are presenting this case to the U.S. Supreme Court now after 13 years of administrative and district court and appellate court litigation. And so the Ethics Commission has spent over $1 million on that case on outside legal counsel trying to collect $10,000 in penalties against Sullivan for failing to register. And you go like, why the world would they spend $1 million to try and collect 10,000? Well, first of all, it's not their money; it's taxpayers' money. It's free money to them. But he's the only person really ever who's actually had the legal team and said, hey, I don't think that this process, I don't think these rules, I don't think this, penalizing me for not registering as a lobbyist because I sent some emails, I don't think this is right, and I'm going to fight back. And so he's the only person ever to fight back. And that, that's a threat to the administrative authority, of the Ethics Commission.
So what was the thrust of the original complaint that was filed against him? Was it that he's not registering as a lobbyist, that that he does need to? Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. So, Texas has a law, it's Chapter 305 of the Government Code, where we regulate lobbying. And that's really regulation of speech. If you go read the statute, it says if you speak to a legislator about a legislative issue and you do so as part of your job, just part of your regular employment, you contact a legislator. So this could be a pastor. If you had an auto shop and, there was a bill that had something to do with that, and you call from the work phone and you call your legislator, arguably, at that moment you make that conversation, you're required to go to the state and pay the state anywhere from $150 to $750 in a licensing fee, and then start filing all of these burdensome monthly disclosures. And so Sullivan was publishing the index and, took the position. He actually talked to a lawyer at the time who kind of, I think, misread the statute. I think maybe he just applied common sense and said, no, you're not a lobbyist. Don't worry about that.
Yeah.
And sure enough, a couple of years later, these legislators who, wanted to weaponize that system against him because they didn't like the criticism that they were getting, out in the districts in like political campaigns about their voting records, they filed these complaints with the Ethics Commission. And the Ethics Commission said, yeah, absolutely. You're telling people how to vote whenever you say you're going to put a bill on the index and you say vote yes or you say vote no. That's telling people how to vote. You're communicating an opinion about legislation. You have to go, pay a fee and get a permit from the state in order to do that. And so, again, this goes back to like basic licensure of speech. It's like licensing newspapers, before the American Revolution. I mean, this is ancient stuff. And so that's been the fight. And, Michael could have settled that case. They actually were willing to settle it for $500, but he was going to have to confess and say, oh, I did something wrong. And he said, no, if I pay the $500 to make it go away and confess, that sets a precedent for every other Texan that everybody can be required to have to go through this process. So I'm going to fight.
Yeah.
And, for having the gall to fight, it's been $1 million litigation all the way to the Supreme Court.
The original fine was $10,000?
Yeah, so they made an offer of $500 settlement, but whenever that was rejected, they then immediately turned around and said, well, because you rejected our settlement, we're going to fine you what they didn't consider the maximum $10,000. They've now taken the position in some other cases. There was a case of a candidate in Houston where they took the position that they could fine that gentleman up to $450,000. And so
how do you get to $450,000? I understand maybe there's some things that people do that might require that sort of punishment, but I don't. If the previous maximum was 10,000, how do you get to 450,000?
Well, what blows your mind is, if I get hit with a speeding ticket, I get to go to a real court and have a jury trial, with all the protections of criminal procedure.
Sure.
But, these people think they can fine you on speech, for a speech ticket, and they can give you a $450,000 fine, and it's a administrative proceeding. But how there's a statute that says triple the amount at issue. And so whatever they consider the amount at issue, there's actually been some kind of pantomiming from the Ethics Commission that if this Sullivan case, if the Supreme Court doesn't intervene, I actually expect they're going to come back and they say, "Oh no, we were wrong. It wasn't $10,000 maximum. It's 3 times his salary in 2010 and 2011." So I can't remember what his salary was. Let's call it $150,000. So we'll find him 900,000.
I was going to say, hopefully he was broke in 2010. That sounds like it could be a lot of money.
Yeah.
So all right. So you guys have been litigating this for a long time. I still don't, I have a hard time understanding if $500 was acceptable. Why is $10,000? Like, why $10,000? Why, if $500, that's a big jump, hey, just give us $500 and this goes away. I understand why Michael Quinn Sullivan said no. I can respect that. What I just don't understand the thinking on the other side. If it's only worth $500, what are you doing this for?
Yeah.
But
Well, I can explain that. I've
sure.
done so TexasScorecard.com. I did a couple of guest pieces, and over the last few weeks, I've done some guest columns about the Ethics Commission and the mistreatment of people. And so I actually compared the case of Katie Christian Magazine, which is what it sounds like. It's a magazine in Katy that deals to Christian audience.
Yeah.
They were fined by the Ethics Commission for charging 2 different candidates who wanted to run ads in that magazine different rates.
Okay.
They didn't know that was against the rules. Allegedly, they did that. And then I compared that with Terry Lowry, who runs what's called the Link Letter in Houston, which is this big, it's accused of being a pay-for-play slate. Basically, candidates buy like $10,000 ads. Same allegation. Hey, you're charging people different prices for ads in a publication. In the Katy Christian Magazine case, I talked to the gentleman who was involved. He was under the mistaken belief that the maximum fine was $500. He was ordered to come to Austin to defend himself. He couldn't make it that day. And so he said, well, whatever, I won't show up. They'll hit me with a $500. They hit him with a $5,000 fine instead of a $500 fine. So surprise, but, and so he's paying that off. Terry Lowry, big political operation there, hired a lawyer, went there and negotiated with them. And he got a $500 fine, right? And so what you see consistently at the Ethics Commission are those who are big political players are savvy. They hire there's a handful of lawyers who deal with the commission. I'm one of very few.
Okay.
Now they don't really like me, so I'm not necessarily the guy to hire. There's some that they kind of get along with, but you send a guy there. And so long as you go to the commission and you say, hey, look, this bureaucracy, you're really important. What you do here is so important. You people are really important people. And I'm really sorry that I transgressed your rules. I just want to make it right. Can we fix it? It's going to be $500, because they don't care, right? But if you don't show up, or you're not able to make it to the hearing, or, certainly if you show up and you say, hey, you shouldn't be able to drag me into the bowels of the Capitol, from any corner of the state to defend my speech. This is wrong, what's happening here. If you take that posture, they absolutely punish you for resisting. And so that's what you consistently see is the high fines are for those who question the commission's authority.
Yeah. So in the Michael Quinn Sullivan case, so briefly walk me through the timeline. Obviously, okay, so he gets the complaint filed against him. They offer him the $500, says no. Is he going to the Texas Ethics Commission? And you said the courts or the hearings, whatever it is, not a court, hearing is secret. Like I couldn't go watch that happen as a public.
Yeah. So when these complaints are filed, they're confidential, and the initial proceedings that happen are confidential. Okay. And so that's one of the things that really frustrates me as a lawyer who works in this space is, if some little guy was getting picked on, I would literally just pro bono go represent him and help him. but I have no way of knowing. This little old lady in Houston who can't drive to Austin for a hearing. Like I would have represented, she was a Democrat too. Like I would have represented this lady. I didn't care, right? But I had no way to know she exists until she's been fined $17,500. So it's these secret proceedings that happen there. Only if you proceed past those secret proceedings, very rare. There's only been like 6 of these. They go on to what's called a formal hearing, which is kind of a public open meeting, little administrative one-day trial.
But not with a judge.
But not with the judge, before the commissioners who've already heard all the evidence before. So you go in front of, it's their staff who are prosecuting you. So they're like judge and jury, and executioner all packed into one. They then hit you with a fine. And in the Sullivan case, that took a couple of years. That was 2 years, multiple trips to the Capitol. I don't know what it would have cost, what he was spending on attorney's fees to defend that, but significant 6-figure, attorney's fee costs. And then so when they hit you with a fine, then you have 30 business days to go file a lawsuit in a district court to go try to overturn that decision. And here's the crazy thing. That's what's called a trial de novo. So you would think, the commission would show up and they would have to litigate like a plaintiff. But they've actually taken the position, no, the respondent, who the accused person, has to be the plaintiff. The commission's the defendant. So you kind of have to prove your innocence in a trial court. And we've had various procedural shenanigans and stuff. Like we were in Fort Worth, and then it got transferred to Austin, and we had to go to the Court of Appeals. So it took years of pretrial proceedings, and then finally they moved and said, well, we're going to move for summary judgment, and we're going to have the trial court just grant summary judgment here. We're not going to let Sullivan go to even get to a trial. The court granted summary judgment, and we've then had to work that up over the last about 3 years or so, just to get it up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the reason it gets there is that these lobbying issues, the Supreme Court's law on this dates back to the 1950s. I mean, it predates modern First Amendment law. It's a total mess. So we're actually hopeful that the court may grant this case because it's such an antiquated area of law. But that's why we haven't been able to win, in the lower courts. The lower courts are like, the law on this is actually crazy. Yeah. So, it's been a wild ride.
So you guys have been through all of the Texas courts. You've seen the Texas Supreme Court on this?
Went to the Texas Supreme Court, got full briefing granted, and then the court said, no, we're not going to take the case.
Okay. So the Supreme Court has not technically heard the case.
Well, they heard it. So we had, we would have had 3 judges, one recused for reasons, kind of relationship reasons. So we had an eight of 9 of the Texas Supreme Court justices. And of those 8, we can presume that we had 3 of them on our side because they granted us full briefing and heard the full case. And then we didn't have a 4th to actually grant the full review and go argue the case in front of the court.
So now you're taking it to the federal Supreme Court,
correct.
And hopefully they will. Hopefully, they have not officially taken it. Is that correct?
No. And look, it's always a long shot when you're the U.S. Supreme Court. There's a very low grant rate, so I mean we're not naive about that. But we've been really excited. So we filed the petition a couple of weeks ago, and Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton actually came in last week and filed an amicus brief urging the court to take the case, which is very much man bites dog, right? Normally, an attorney general is saying, hey, we're going to defend the state. But here, Paxton is actually coming in and he said, this state agency, it's out of control. The law is a mess here. What's happening to this gentleman is a problem. Court, you need to step in and intervene. And we've just had some more amicus briefs, the Cato Institute, Foundation for Individual Rights. It used to be an education. Anyway, it's FIRE, the free speech group. Cato, FIRE, Institute for Free Speech will be in, and others. So we're starting to collect a whole group of amici who are coming in and saying, hey, this issue is really important. It impacts Americans nationwide. And we've got real muddled precedent from the various federal courts, circuit courts and everything else. Supreme Court, you should take this case. So it's very exciting to see, maybe the court will take it.
So it's interesting in the Texas courts, I get you said that it sort of flips, right? So in this case, Michael Quinn Sullivan becomes the plaintiff and the Texas Ethics Commission becomes the defendant. And so Michael Quinn Sullivan is then sort of trying to prove his innocence.
Right.
As the Texas Ethics Commission, have they made arguments in front of a judge as to what their position is and why? And
Yeah, I mean,
what have those
so
arguments been?
sure, yeah. So their position is, hey, go look at all these emails, and there's a handful of other things. He was part of a coalition letter that said we need a new speaker. Let's get rid of this Joe Strauss character and have a conservative speaker. There were like hundreds of people on this letter, and they said, well, Sullivan's on this letter. This letter is a lobbying communication. There were a few meetings. There was a Wednesday meeting where conservative grassroots groups would get together, or sometime legislators would be invited to present about their legislation. It's actually funny. It's not lobbying. The legislators are kind of lobbying these groups to support like their priorities.
Yeah.
It's the other way around from what you traditionally think of as lobbying. But they said, oh, well, that meeting, that's evidence of lobbying. One of the funny things is they never could draw a line to say, oh, well, on Tuesday, Sullivan was not a lobbyist, but on Wednesday, it was too much, he crossed the line and all of a sudden it was too much speech. And at that point, he was a lobbyist. They could never draw that line. I mean, they basically just said, look at this guy. He talks about legislation too much, and he didn't pay the permit, and he didn't file the forms. And you can't talk about legislation too much and criticize the legislature and get on their bad side without having your paperwork in order. And if you don't, get ready, get $1 million legal budget, and fight it for 15 years.
So, I mean, I guess the way that you're describing it, I'm not a lobbyist, I don't think.
And you
And
might be.
so, I'm trying to think of a situation where this might apply to me and maybe listeners could, do the same thing. In my case, I'm doing podcasts and I don't know, maybe there's a bill out there, House bill, whatever, that's, I guess, regulates my industry more. I have to get a license to be a podcaster in Texas, let's say. And I email my representative or all the representatives and say, hey, as a podcaster, I think this, infringes on my rights and it's it's over burdensome, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah.
In the test, would I be at risk of being a lobbyist in that case? Because I'm trying to, I get paid to do podcasting, but no one's paying me to send that email.
Yeah. So if nobody's paying you to send the email, then you would be able to defend yourself. You could be accused of it. So if somebody
Sure.
said he did that as part of his job, then they would accept jurisdiction and start investigating you.
Okay.
Right. So that's all that takes. Somebody doesn't like you, and then like fills the forms out
Hopefully
correctly. And
people like me, Tony.
yeah, yeah. Well, but nobody. Hopefully people don't. Right. Hopefully, typically if you're being effective,
Yeah,
right? People who are effective draw criticism. You
sure.
create people who say, I don't like this person being effective because it's goring my ox or whatever. And so, they always say, you don't take flack unless you're over the target, right?
Yeah.
And so those people who get over the target, like they're going to catch some flack. And I can say it's like, I have a group that I'm defending out of Kerrville, a little citizen group, and they put out a simple flyer that said, hey, here's some city council members that we want you to vote for. Oh, yeah, here's some propositions that are on the local ballot. Vote yes on this, vote no on this bond, blah, blah, blah. It was little flyers to hand out at the polls to
Okay.
people. And somebody who they hired, their opponents there hired a law firm. They looked at the flyer and they said, oh, you said Roman Garcia mayor, right? Roman Garcia mayor. And I said,
Yeah.
you had to say Roman Garcia for mayor, right? There's a rule that says you have to say for because he's
Sure.
not the incumbent mayor. Somebody might be misled. If you say Roman Garcia mayor, they might think that he is the mayor. And so you have to say Roman Garcia for mayor. And if you don't say for mayor, that's a crime,
Yeah.
right? And so we'll file this complaint. Now, this commission accepted that, began an investigation. We've had to fight them about it. So, I mean, like, that's the kind of stuff. But on this lobbying stuff, to give you a real world example, I talked to a lady a couple of months ago who was involved in this fight over, pornography in libraries. And so she had gotten involved with her local schools and local libraries and identifying and saying, well, these are pornographic books that are in the children's section in my
Sure.
local library. And so she called me. She says, hey, my lawyer said I might have to register as a lobbyist. I'm a little worried about that. And so I went through it. I was like, well, do you have a job? No, she doesn't get paid anything to do this. So it's like, okay, you're not in that. And then we realized, wait a second, she actually buys copies of these books and delivers them to the legislators to say, well, here's the books I'm complaining about.
Yeah.
And we started adding the math up, and sure enough, she was not over the threshold. But had she spent more than $970 in a quarter on those books, then she'd have to register as a lobbyist, right? So there's a lot of little ways that you can fall into this.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned, somebody, if your job was, if it's, hey, my job's a podcaster and then something's going to impact podcasting, I contact my legislator. Now, the single communication alone shouldn't trigger it, but there's this whole idea in the statute of what's called preparatory time. So anytime you spend preparing to lobby counts as lobbying. Anytime you spend building goodwill counts as lobbying. So if you have any other communications with a legislator where you like get to know them, like that can trigger it. If you spend time reading legislation, if you stay abreast of like what goes on in the Capitol, you watch the proceedings of the House floor, and then you go communicate with a legislator, those things could be enough to trigger you being considered a lobbyist under the statute.
What
so
if I mean,
it's very loosey-goosey.
it sounds like there's a lot of unintentional lobbyists out here in Texas.
Sure.
If I posted something on social media, like encouraging my followers to, I don't know, email their legislator to say, hey, HB, whatever about podcasters, don't do that. That
Yeah,
lobbying?
not in Texas. That's called grassroots lobbying.
Okay.
But I would call it grassroots lobbying. The state of New York actually would regulate that. But
Okay.
in Texas, we're safe on that. But we did realize this: if you were to make up, literally make up books that had your opinion about legislation, and you went down to the street and you just handed them out. Hey, anybody who wants this book about my opinion about cutting taxes or whatever, right? You're handing the books out.
Yeah.
That's like totally like you couldn't be more First Amendment core protected activity than that. You have a right to do that, right? But if you self-published this book and you went to the Capitol and you went and stood in front of the Capitol and you started handing it to passerbys, if legislative staff or legislators walked past and took the book, then you'd be a lobbyist.
Okay. Well, my understanding is that lobbyists they typically are seen as making a lot of money, and hopefully if I'm an unintended lobbyist, some of that money comes my way. So
the threshold's $1,900, and that's even just in reimbursement, so not even compensation. So that's pretty low.
So going back to the Michael Quinn Sullivan case, trying to be respectful of your time here. You guys get it to the Supreme Court. Hopefully, whether you win or if you win, let's say you win, what happens then?
Yeah. So, I mean, if we win, what'll happen is the U.S. Supreme Court will look at this issue of like, when can governments regulate this kind of activity and what kind of rules can they put in place, generally speaking.
Sure.
They haven't addressed this issue since the 1950s. Their modern First Amendment jurisprudence kind of started to develop in like the 60s and 70s. So like that case law just completely predates, anything that we would even recognize as modern First Amendment law. And so that's where we're at. Like, whenever you go to the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, it's not about error correction. It's not even about, oh, hey, this is a really sympathetic case. It's not even, the court could look at the case and say, this is a really sympathetic petitioner, and this case has been totally decided wrong, and we could fix it. They still won't grant that case unless there's like national implications.
Yeah.
And so what we're asking them is this really national implication issue of like, how should courts look at these kind of questions?
Yeah.
And so we're hopeful that they'll take that, but that's what's at stake. If they don't take it, we're going to be back in Travis County District Court with the Ethics Commission continuing to try to collect $10,000, or maybe they try to seek more.
Yeah.
From Michael Quinn Sullivan to fine him for stuff that happened, at that point, we're nearing 2 decades ago.
Yeah.
That's where we would be.
So with the Texas, I have to ask you about taxpayer-funded lobbying because it just keeps gnawing in my mind here. But with the Texas Ethics Commission, I don't know if you want to opine on this. If you don't, totally understandable.
I always have an opinion.
In your mind, is there something, what should be done about the Texas Ethics Commission to make it more fair in your mind?
Sure. Yeah. So uh, I don't think the process there really can be fixed. I think it's crazy, that the closed door, secretive, no due process is just bad. The fact that they meet in Austin and that anybody from Texarkana to El Paso to Brownsville to Dalhart could get dragged and said, you have to come to Austin to come defend yourself. Like that's unfixable. And so, but to the extent that it's a bad process, like, okay, what I would say is a very simple fix. They need to be told they have no jurisdiction over private individuals, right? If government officials, if legislators get dragged into a process that's not fair to them, that really isn't my concern, right?
Okay.
I mean, I am a little sympathetic, but what I care about are private individuals being dragged before the ethics commission from every corner of the state. And so that's the fix. The ethics commission is going through sunset review at the legislature right now. There should be an ethics commission sunset bill filed. That bill should contain a line in it that says this agency has no jurisdiction over persons who are not, elected officials or public employees, right? I mean, that's the solution in my mind, really simple solution. But it would be, it would be a big shift because it would say, hey, we're not going to have another Michael Quinn Sullivan case that goes on for 15 years.
Yeah.
Let's go about the taxpayer funded lobbying thing. I think where it gets complicated is people want to regulate lobbyists. Like they're like, oh, lobbyists need to be regulated. We need to be regulating these lobbyists. But then it's like, well, who's a lobbyist? And, obviously, whenever somebody says, I'm a professional lobbyist and I make millions of dollars a year, like, people know what that is.
Sure.
But what happens is this system, just like all regulatory systems in government, it's subject to regulatory capture. It actually protects those big incumbent players because those guys go in front of the commission, they hire the right lawyer, they pay their $750 off their $1 million, salaries that they're making. If there's never really been a prosecution on one of those types of people ever, but let's say there was, they would pay the $500 and make it go away. It'd be no problem, right?
Yeah.
So what you really have here is something that's not effective as a regulation of anything that anybody would want regulated, and is instead just traps and trip ups that can be used against private citizens for their unpopular political speech.
Yeah. Well, just real briefly, I've talked to, some senators and representatives on the show about taxpayer funded lobbying. And, I think the argument, devil's advocate is, the city of Austin or county, Travis County or whatever city, doesn't matter. They have a right to, I guess, go before go before the state house or the governor, whoever, Senate, and lobby their case. This is what we do and don't like. And they say, well, we have the representatives and senators' responses is typically, well, they have our phone number, they can always call us. And I can sympathize with that. Would they have to be, Mayor Kirk Watson, let's say, would he have to be registered as a lobbyist because he's getting paid a salary and then he's contacting his representative and talking to them about this, and maybe he has lunch with them or whatever, right? Getting to know them. It's politics, after all, they do that. Would he then be a lobbyist and the mayor?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, under the regulation, I'm with you. I kind of view it. If some school superintendent wants to travel down to Austin and meet with the reps and kind of give their opinion, I don't have any problem with it. I don't think. Obviously, that is in a way they're a taxpayer-funded employee. They're going to Austin to lobby on something. I think the problem is where you have these these government agencies taking taxpayer dollars, giving it to professional lobbyists, outsourcing the job, to some hired gun in Austin. I think it gets difficult to say, well, what's a hired gun? I think there are some solutions. When lobbying regulations started back in like the 1930s, the way it was originally done was that courts said, okay, we're just not going to enforce a lobbying contract. So if I hired you and said, hey, I want you to go lobby for me at the legislature, I'll pay you $10,000 to do it. And then I stiffed you and you sued me and I went before a court, the court says, well, we don't really like this whole lobbying thing. And so we're just not going to enforce that contract, right? Yeah. And that's how it started. And that's not really, okay, maybe that's good or maybe that's bad, but it's not prone to the kind of abuse that this kind of administrative regulation situation is. And so maybe we get back to something like that, where we just say, look, taxpayer money should not go to the hired, on contracts for this purpose.
Yeah.
And if you don't get paid, you can't sue over it. It's not enforceable, right?
Yeah.
Those would be some ways to deal with that.
Well, Tony McDonald, I really appreciate you taking the time. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Do you have a website or social media or anything else that you would like to plug before we sign off?
Sure. Yeah. People can find me on X at tweet Tony Mac. So if they want to follow me there, I'm usually following up on this stuff and things involving the legislature. Like I said, I ran a couple of columns at texasscorecard.com, some guest columns there about the Ethics Commission that are worth a read. And then people can find me at tonymcdonald.com. And I will say this, if you are ever accused and dragged before the Ethics Commission and you don't know what to do, at risk of my wife getting very mad at me for doing a lot of late night work for free or whatever, I will not let people suffer through this alone. Like people who people who can't afford a lawyer. I have done pro bono stuff before. I'll do it again. Call me, find me, and do not just face it alone. I mean, it's not fair to people to not have an attorney in a process as crazy as this. And so I will help people if it ever happens. So TonyMcDonald.com if you ever need me.
Great. Well, we'll put the links down in the description below. Tony McDonald, thank you so much.
Thanks, sir.